Welcome to Once Upon a Rimworld. Our story begins the starship Pegasus, a small military freighter bound for a far-flung Rimworld outpost. Its precious cargo of janitors and other sanitation-related crew are utterly vital to the day-to-day running of these installations. But something terrible is about to happen. With the majority of the ship's crew all stashed away inside their cryosleep caskets, a single solitary janitor is left to maintain and keep in order the ship. It is only a single solitary janitor who hears the alarms though. The alarms that go off warning that they are off course, headed towards an unrelated Rimworld about to be sucked into the gravity well. The janitor acts quickly, springing into action and running to a control panel. She punches in coordinates for the escape pods to be aimed at one of the planet's land masses, for surely landing in the water would spell a death sentence for any crew that managed to get off this godforsaken ship. Even though she acts, it hasn't been quickly enough. Even as she puts in the wake-up sequence codes for her fellow crewmates' cryosleep caskets to be awakened, she already knows, looking at the collision countdown timer, that not all of them will make it off the ship alive. The last of the codes input, she takes a deep breath before dashing off to her own escape pod. What will await them below? Only time will tell. The metal of the ship screamed in protest as it descended through the upper atmosphere of Galmaria, as the three colonists who would later survive dashed to their escape pods. The first to jump into hers was Jet, none other than one of the military officers on board. Left for dead at a young age, Jet was rescued by an old man who ran an Rimworld junkyard. The old man forced Jet to do dangerous, demanding work, and Jet became very familiar with machines, but she grew up with almost no other experiences. Obsessed with interstellar travel, Jet left behind her desolate life at the junkyard and joined a military academy in hopes of becoming a pilot. She was trained in advanced combat and survival skills while she excelled in her studies. Jet was a loner and never really cared about her crewmates. The next crew member to make it to her escape pod was Gustav, the ship's janitor that had woken everybody up and allowed them to escape. Gustav was greatly affected by a traumatic event in her early life. For many years, she refused to speak to people, preferring instead to play with her household's numerous pets. As a result, she was a mute. As an adult, she had become a starship janitor. While other passengers passed the years between star systems in cryosleep sarcophagi, Gustav had to wake up at periodic intervals to perform inspections, check navigation systems, and to oil the mechanoids. The final crew member to make it off of the ill-fated ship was Shadow, a man of a different metal. As a child, he'd been a Navy pathfinder, raised and trained by a group of military explorers dedicated to charting the pathways through deep space and on remote planets. Continuing down this path, he became as an adult a Shadow Marine. Perfecting his skills as a pathfinder, Shadow left his unit to put his skills to use on planets he helped chart. Familiar with orbital trade routes, he was able to get onto and off of any planet without being detected. Then simultaneously, the three escape pods accelerated away from the doomed ship, just in time in fact as the ship behind it finally disintegrated into small pieces, leaving those who were unlucky to their fates. Tumbling through the air, somehow the three escape pods managed to make a surprisingly graceful landing on the planet's surface below, and quickly, Jet, Gustav, and Shadow found themselves in a small, lightly wooded area. With scant resources around them, they scrambled quickly to gather up what they could and protect themselves from any initial threats that they may find. But instead of threats, they found instead a friendly warg, which they quickly named Schnook, for whatever reason there may be for that. His survival instincts taking over, Shadow sprung into action and quickly managed to arm himself with what little gear he found in the ship. An old-style bolt-action rifle and some aging Kevlar armor. Jet with a revolver and Gustav with nothing but a knife the three of them began making plans to survive in this new, unknown Rimworld. After a quick discussion, the three of them began frantically searching through the wreckage of their escape pods, desperately and frantically looking for their emergency distress beacons. Somehow, unluckily it seemed, all three distress beacons were destroyed in the crash down to the planet's surface, raising some serious questions about the durability of these products, and certainly what role, if any, they play in an emergency situation, such as this. A quick bit of scouting of their local vicinity revealed what Shadow believed to be a road. Surely, if any help were to come, it would be via this. Quickly, it was decided that they would set up camp by this road and await help. All they could do was do their best to survive till then. Working hard to bring together what little resources they had from their destroyed escape pods, they found themselves in a torrential downpour. It became immediately obvious if they were to have any chance of survival on this planet, they would need some kind of shelter. With the abundance of wood nearby, they began chopping down the trees and fashioning them into rough logs to make a wooden structure. None of them being fans of being exceptionally moist, they worked with hurried hands to make sure their erection was complete. Finally though, and with relative ease, they finished their modest-sized building, and with a roof over their heads, settled in for their first night on the Rimworld. The next morning, it was decided that Shadow would go out and complete a more thorough scouting of their immediate vicinity, while Jet and Gustav would stay behind and turn their attention to the next highest priority after shelter: food. Somehow, despite destroying all three emergency distress beacons in the escape pods, this precious and delicate cache of seeds aboard each one had survived, meaning that they would be able to plant what could be quite a sizable crop, and again raised more questions about how on earth these escape beacons were ever fitted to ships when they were clearly so delicate. Nearing the end of their second day on the Rimworld, they finally finished at what was a very large rice paddy. Genetically modified to grow quicker and have higher yields, it would surely produce some delicious and well-needed food soon. On the third day, it was decided that their budding colony would need some names. They decided to call themselves the Lost, and this particular village, Hope. Perhaps this was some kind of deep, profound statement, or indeed, perhaps instead, this was the result of a shallow and unimaginative mind of whatever ethereal being led these pawns to their fate. Noticing what precious little supplies that they had were starting to deteriorate from being outside, exposed to the elements, it was decided that they would build yet another structure, this one some kind of storage area, allowing them to protect these precious resources from the elements outside. They didn't just stop here, however. They also added on an extra expansion, a new cooking facility, and also a giant walk-in freezer, allowing them to store meat and meals well beyond their normal expiry, because not only were they not fans of being exceptionally moist, they also were not extremely excited at the prospect of getting food poisoning. After these expansions, it became immediately obvious that they had exhausted what little steel resources they had left over from their crash, and Shadow was dispatched to attempt to find some stockpiles of steel from nearby. As Shadow hiked through the woods, he prayed and he prayed that he would find what he was looking for. After all, steel was vital for all modern technologies and vital for their very survival. Fortunately, his prayers were eventually answered as he came across a huge deposit of steel, somehow just miraculously dumped on the surface of the ground. Whether it had come from space or whether there were other magical forces at play here, who could tell? Soon, however, our heroes realized that the greatest resource that they lacked was not indeed steel, but in fact, knowledge. Jet, in her previous life, had spent a great deal of time driving through the Hollywood Hills in her Lamborghini, and she knew that knowledge was the key to success. So they made a research station, and they set about becoming more knowledgeable and learned about relevant and powerful things, such as batteries. Not just this, however, was exciting. They finally had their first yield of their genetically modified rice that would help substitute what meat they'd managed to hunt and what little berries they'd managed to forage. That evening, they settled in for another uneventful night. Taking a break from the food harvesting and stone brick production that they'd slaved on so hard all day, Gustav, however, awoke early, ready to do some more harvesting, when she heard a faint crash in the distance and was intrigued. She set off into the darkness, unsure of what she would find. Looking down nervously at the knife in her hand, she wondered, would this be enough? Was this a good idea? And then she heard it, a fell voice upon the wind, a cry of agony. Was that a human voice? Yes, definitely, it was a human voice. She began to walk with more urgency towards the voice, and there it is, a very, very unhappy man. She grabbed him urgently, seeing the blood everywhere, picked him up off the ground, and began to bring him home back towards their base. He yelled in protest and tried to fight her off, but he was too weak from the impact. Unsure of what to do with him, she stashed him in the battery room and then sought the others for help. She gave basic medical treatment to him to stop his profuse bleeding. Who was this man? Where did he come from? Where did he go? Where did he come from? Cotton Eye Joe. After a brief time of rest and recuperation, the stranger explained that his name was Rune, and that he came from a warlike faction that had noticed the escape pods come down to the ship's surface, and that he had been sent to scout for loot and any potential survivors to kill and take into slavery. He told them that if he did not return, that they would come looking for him. If they did not release him, they would be doomed. Despite being a mute, Gustav was an exceptional judge of character. Perhaps it was because she spent so much time sitting, observing people, their body language, the way they act. Or maybe it's because it just suits this story arc, if she is. Who can tell? But one way or another, she trusted Rune. There was something about him. And it was agreed and communicated to the others that he would be allowed to leave and return home to his people on the single condition that he would tell them that nothing was worth coming here for. That he had been held up and delayed, but there was absolutely no reason for them to return to this part of the world again. That was the single condition, and Rune cautiously agreed. And they made plans that as soon as he was well enough to leave under his own volition, then it would be so. Thus securing the vital safety of our 3 colonists and the future of this little village. After a couple days further rest, Rune eventually decided that he'd regained enough of his strength and he was ready to return home to his people. The longer they delayed, the higher the chance that they would come looking for him. So Shadow released him. He thanked them for their mercy and set about his purposeful journey home. Gustav, Jet, and Shadow were comforted by the knowledge that because of them, they'd done the right thing, and that they were no longer under the imminent threat of raids, attacks, death, and slavery. Comforted by the knowledge that Rune would continue his journey home, live a long and prosperous life, and allow them to exist long enough, perhaps, to find peace, to find help, and maybe even one day for our heroes to return home. Wouldn't that be nice? Or maybe other things are set into motion. Maybe other events will happen now. Maybe, just maybe, this story is long from over.
When they say to me in our eyes know we believe you're not crazy, just a little sad, and you're not